Let me tell you, man, it just hits different when the Winnipeg Jets are back in the win column. The Jets finally ended their 5-game losing streak against the Pittsburgh Penguins, getting revenge. Find out how on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. Download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your very first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Now, like I said, the Jets finally got a major win, and obviously for Winnipeg, I think this was probably one of those games where, for the Jets, Winnipeg was looking for a bit of a rebound, right? Winnipeg hadn't had a great game in some time, and honestly, I think there was a little bit of a lack of self-belief, maybe. Perhaps there was some angst amongst the fan base. A lot of folks were kind of in the boat of feeling like things were sliding back as they did last January, which was, let's just say it was one of the most brutal second-half collapses we've seen from this team. Although, if we're being honest, there were warning signs heading into that whole collapse that told us that perhaps the Jets might be onto something that would start to resemble a bit of a downswing. All that said, I don't think anyone really expected the Jets to crater as badly as they did last year, and the concern that they do it again this year, I would say it's not invalid, but I will say that I do think the Jets are different than they were last year. I think what happened in the previous season was that the team wasn't as good as the record was, or at least made it look. And I think the team sort of found out what the reality of the situation was. The lack of offensive creation, the poor play, and the occasional defensive mistakes started to add up. And then once the shooting percentage plummeted, suddenly Winnipeg looked really vulnerable. But the warning signs were there all along, so it wasn't exactly a surprise. This year, I tend to feel like that's not exactly the case. I don't really think this team has that sort of collapse in them. But I was a little bit worried heading into this Pens game. After having the rough taste of losing to Pittsburgh and then Philadelphia and then having to come back over the weekend and play Pittsburgh again, would the Jets get some home ice advantage? And in this case, kind of. I would say the Jets at 5v5 were okay. They had a really good first period or so, and then, the Pens started taking over in the second and third. But by that point, Hellebuyck and the offense had done enough to keep the Jets in the lead, and that's kind of how it ended, right? It was just a 2-1 game. Not a lot happening for the goal-scoring records, but it wasn't for a lack of trying. Both Jarry and Hellebuyck were very busy with some very high-danger chances, some chaos down low, and so I think this was probably more of a goaltending battle than I expected it to be, but you know what? Sometimes that's how it is. Thankfully, Hellebuyck just happens to be a little bit better. I will say the one biggest takeaway from this game is that the top line is relatively back, right? Connor, Scheifele, and Ehlers, they actually did score, although I think one lesson that I continue to take away from this trio is that when I watch them, Connor just doesn't really feel like he fits. I know that Bones was asked earlier this weekend, or even today, it might have been about reuniting that trio of Ehlers, Scheifele, and Vilardi, and he said, well, I might, but part of the issue is that he doesn't want to put Perfetti on the right wing side. So I can see why he would feel a little bit uncomfortable with that, but overall, right, at some point you might have to go back to that because KFC, look, his best attribute is scoring, and when he's not scoring, he doesn't really bring enough to a line. It's strange to say that about a guy who has perennially been like a 40-plus goal scorer, or at least 30 to 35 or more, but when you see him kind of struggled to know where to be, how to really integrate with his line mates effectively, and kind of play that tiki-taka style that really suits Scheifele and Ehlers around the slot area, you start to realize, well, maybe you got to find a better spot for him, because it's clear that KFC can be very effective in the right role. But I feel like on the first line, with the way that Ehlers and Scheifele kind of navigate around the crease area, how they create offense, it just doesn't really fit how Connor wants to play. And I feel like Connor has tried to change his game, but more often than not, you'll see him make a really bad pass. It gets countered against, and it's not like Ehlers making a risky pass. With Connor, it's more like it's very obvious it's not going to work, and it's either behind or just off target or not really the right decision. You'd rather him just shoot. And I think that has kind of added some hesitation to his game, where traditionally he'd be a shooter, he wouldn't really think twice about it, and he'd probably score. Now he's trying to integrate better with his line mates, and I feel like that's actually not working out for him. So at some point, I do think that trio does need an adjustment. I know that Rick has said he doesn't like the idea of Perfetti at right wing, but at some point you might just have to swallow a bit of a bullet and kind of go with it, because as it is right now, that trio is effective, but it feels like it could be a lot better with the right substitution. So something to kind of stew on. Maybe the trio of Connor, Perfetti, and Monahan could get something going. I don't know how you would exactly arrange that, but I do kind of think Monahan and Connor might have some issues together. I don't know. All I know is that as it is right now, the top line is at least looking better, but not fantastic. Also, kind of getting off the schneid was Niederreiter, who hadn't really scored in 16 games or something. It was a while. And I think for Nino, his last few contributions have mostly been in the sin bin. So it was nice to see him get a goal off of a second chance opportunity. Was actually set up by a nice Logan Stanley pass, which is kind of funny because Logan had already had a really rough game up until that point. So you see shades of him being a much more effective attacking blue liner, but thankfully, in this instance, he was doing it in the right end of the ice and not giving the puck to the opponents like he did earlier in the first period. So a nice little assist, and for Nino, a good goal. Hopefully, it kind of sparks him back to life, because it feels like the last few months from him haven't really been as effective as he was earlier this season. But everyone goes through slumps. It's just about how you bust it, and hopefully this win is going to get the Jets a little bit more confidence to get back on the winning side of things and keep the momentum going, especially for this final stretch of 35 or so games. But of course, on the subject of getting things going, I thought it'd be really important to talk about why it's critical now for the Jets to kind of rekindle the vibes and how they can make this last stretch of the season really count for something with fans. We'll get into that in just a moment. Before we go any further, though, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at Sleeper. It's almost the halfway point, just a little bit past in the season, and obviously the Jets have kind of had some fun times. They've had a couple of ruts. For the most part, though, the good outweighs the bad, right? Winnipeg is in a top spot, but regardless of where we are in the current standings, I want to remind you that you could win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports, and especially hockey, because with Sleeper, you could win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. Obviously, for those of you who are big stats nerds and you love following your favorite players, whether it's McDavid, McCarr, McKinnon, Ehlers, Scheifele, Hellebuck, Vasilevsky, some years Ottinger, right? Whoever it is, no matter your favorite player, if you're more old-fashioned, Crosby and Ovechkin, can't go wrong there. You know their goals, you know their assists. Well, it's time to put that knowledge to work, because if you can beat Sleeper's projections for a given game, whether it's more or less for a certain stats category like assists, goals, all that fun stuff, you could win big, especially because if you get 8 stats categories right for a given game, you could win 100 times your bet on Sleeper. That's right, 8 player stats for a single game, and you could win 100 times your bet on Sleeper. So start paying attention and nail your picks so you can start winning big. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your very first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are talking about the post-win vibes and how things are kind of on track to get back going again, and hopefully getting the vibes up after what was a little bit of a rough stretch between, before and after the All-Star break, right? The vibes were kind of down. The fan sentiment was starting to turn a little bit sour. I know I had a rant or two in between where I felt like there were some games where the Jets just didn't really show up. Other times I was kind of like, all right, I don't want to really overreact, but there were some moments where I was feeling a little bit reactionary, if I'm being honest. We all have it, right? We'll talk about why it's really important for the Jets to make Canada Life Center a fortress, though, and get those vibes, because it can be one of the most raucous places in the league. But before we dive into that, just wanted to shout out a really cool thing the Locked On Network is doing. We have launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and you can also find us on Amazon Fire TV. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with our national shows and our local experts covering every league. Find the Locked On Sports Today channel now on Amazon Fire TV and YouTube. Circling back to Jets vibes, obviously for this team, I would say the last 2 years, including this one, have really focused on rebuilding the locker room and the team's image, right? After last season and the prior years, I think there was a loss of confidence in what the Winnipeg Jets were. The team's identity was a bit of a mystery. The leadership was all over the place. There was rumor of locker room friction and guys not really getting along, a generational divide, and of course the team had to do some, I would say, roster surgery to try and fix some of those problems. And then, of course, the Dubois thing happened, and, obviously, in some ways, that actually improved morale, I think, because, what the Jets got back in that trade was a pretty massive haul. So overall, vibes were kind of getting back on course. I think for this final stretch of the regular season, it's really important for the Jets to kind of maintain that momentum and good vibe energy, because Canada Life Center the last few years for me has been something of a mausoleum. It's been a while since I've been back, and I know that, the last time I was there, it was still called MTS, so times have changed, but I think the general thought that I've had watching the home games is that in a lot of the instances I've seen, it's quiet. It feels like there's not that much buzz, and I don't know if it's tentativeness. I don't know if it's the crowd maybe changing, but, Canada Life or whatever it's been called when you were there, you've seen it when it was a lot livelier, I'm sure. And I feel like the Jets need to make home ice a fortress again, because this team really feeds off that energy. When Canada Life is rocking and rolling and loud and boisterous, it can be one of the most imposing rinks out there. It's very vertical. There's a wall of noise. It's hard for opponents to communicate. And it feels like Winnipeg really feeds off that energy, especially heading into the postseason. Now, this is kind of more on like the, I guess, I don't know how to describe it, stuff that's not really important in the grand scheme of things when it comes to like tactics and strategy, but it's more, I would say, a part of the fan experience. And if you want to kind of put butts in seats, having that atmosphere again, I think would be really cool, and fostering it too. The Jets fan atmosphere, I feel like, has kind of been improving recently, but it's still got a ways to go to get where it was several years ago when everyone was bought in, people were committed, and the team had the city's heart really in its hands. So, if the Jets can kind of get that pulse going again, I think it'd be great. Winnipeg in the playoffs has the chance to be really imposing, and I think this is a season where I want to see the Jets go on a really deep run. They've got this 2-year window, including this season, to really make hay, and then things start to become a big question mark after that, where you start to change over to like the next core, and that's cool. That's fine, but I think I want to see this team, as it is right now, make a big, deep playoff run. And for the Jets, hopefully they agree. I think they can honestly get fans excited again. I think it'd be nice to have more sellouts. We had a sellout this past weekend against Pittsburgh, which, given it's the Pens, that makes sense, right? You get to see Crosby and Malkin and some of the legends of recent Penguins history. But more importantly, I think for the Jets, they just want to have a sellout period, right? Get the fans all in attendance, get the barn rocking. The Jets have had some really boisterous celebrations recently, but, in the past couple of weeks, it's been a little bit muted because, well, the Jets haven't exactly had a great record. So nice to see at least some sign of life this past weekend. let's hope it continues because the Jets have another home game before they take on the Vancouver Canucks on the road next weekend. So a lot of interesting stuff to talk about this week, but one thing that did happen earlier today was that Dominic Toninato was sent down to the minors. We'll talk about what that means and who it's for in just a little bit. But before we go any further, let's talk about our friends and partners at FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and so much more. For me, obviously, I'm not as much of a big basketball fan. I track some of the big stars like LeBron and Steph, but obviously there's a whole new generation, Jokic and a few other guys. But, Giannis, for me, I think it might be one of my favorite stories. I always really enjoy all of the stuff about him, especially knowing his background and where he came from. But even if I'm not perhaps the biggest basketball fan, I can still win big by going to FanDuel.com/lockedon. And you should too. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon, where you can shoot your shot for a chance to win big. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are wrapping up really quickly with some announcements about Dominic Toninato and some roster moves and what it means for the rest of the team. Obviously, Toninato was probably one of the few guys that you could say was comfortably an odd man out when it came to this team, not because he was poor or anything. I think he'd actually done a pretty good job the last few weeks of filling in for spot duty. I think his promotions and elevations perhaps didn't go nearly as well as he'd hoped, but when he was a fourth line center, things were generally pretty okay. So a big thanks to him for having to shoulder some additional responsibility, probably more than he was expecting. I think, given what he was asked to do, he generally did pretty well. But now the Jets need to make a roster move. And, unfortunately, it wasn't for the one that I was hoping for. Ville Heinola is not getting a recall to the team, which is a little bit disappointing. Also, not exactly surprising. I think we all sort of knew that this was probably going to be Logan Stanley's run for the 3 games while Dylan was out. And, my own feelings aside, all I can say is that I feel like Ville probably would have done well against the Sharks if you wanted to integrate him into the team and kind of avoid what Rick was talking about, which was throwing him in unprepared. This probably would have been the game to do it. They only have like 1 game in the next 5 days before they take on the Canucks. This would have been a good chance to see what his timing and spacing is like, especially because, guess what? The Sharks are kind of last or so, or around last in the league. This is probably one of the few teams where Heinola would actually have some room to work with, and he's been doing well enough with the Moose to where I feel like the upgrade from the NHL or from the AHL to the NHL might not be as difficult for him as it is for some other players, but that's not going to be the case. I feel like Rick just doesn't trust him, and if that's the case going forward, that's really disappointing. I felt like after the preseason camp, he had honestly earned a spot, and even Rick seemed to feel like he was getting a role with the team, but that has seemingly died out with the injury. It's a shame. Maybe it's just a temporary thing. Maybe next season he'll have a full-time role once the Jets kind of consolidate some roster spots on the blue line. But all I can say is, having watched enough of Logan Stanley over the years, I really feel like not using Heinola and really kind of limboing him has put a huge dent in his development trajectory. He, at one point, was probably one of our most promising D prospects. And then, in between a couple of mediocre showings where he was also kind of thrown to the wolves and also having some perhaps struggles earning coaching favor, it just feels like his entire career has sort of been derailed. But like at the AHL level, seemingly no problems there. So it's just convincing the front office that he finally deserves a chance to get with the big club. And I think Chevy has probably wanted him to join the Jets for a long time, just has not found a coaching staff that feels comfortable enough to actually have that happen. So, not great, but at least in the meantime, we're getting David Gustafsson back, which I can't really be upset about. For those of you who know this podcast well, you know that I'm personally a very big Gustafsson fan. I've always enjoyed watching him. He's a huge, monstrous player with a great transition game. still some offensive skills to be worked out. I think that there's more to his game that I'd like to see him grow out, but he's getting there over time. I feel like of the players that are coming back from injury, Gus has a good chance to cement himself as one of Winnipeg's better fourth liners. I know that Kupari has done an okay job, but I feel like Gustafsson's a little more consistent, at least in terms of decision making. Kupari, for me, just hasn't really seized the role all that effectively, and I wouldn't be shocked to see him kind of get flexed out at some point, maybe to like a 13th forward sort of role at some point. But I don't know. He's a weird one because he's got really good speed and he can be a fun player, but there's just parts of him that don't seem to quite gel and work all together to form a quality NHLer. He seems like what somebody dubbed him as like a quad A player, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, that's not to say that Kupari will be that forever. At some point, he might finally start to put all the pieces together to become a really good everyday sort of NHLer, but as it is right now, I still think I have Gustafsson ahead, although it wouldn't shock me if Bones keeps Kupari in for now and uses Gustafsson as the 13th forward. But all that to say, I felt like this was a good chance to get Heinola back into the lineup, see what he was capable of, and perhaps get him some rotations against some softer competition. But it is what it is. I mean, I've spent a lot of time talking about the Heinola situation over the years. It's probably not changing until he gets traded. So if he does get moved, all I can hope for is that the return isn't crappy, because I feel like whoever does finally get Heinola will probably start to realize he's an absolute stud in possession and could be a super exciting player to rely upon. But maybe that'll be the Jets this season or next at some point. Who's to say? All I can say is I hope for the best for him and perhaps a bright future, whether it's in Winnipeg or somewhere else. But let me know what you think about the recent roster moves and discussions for the Jets. Are you happy with the way the blue line is constructed? Do you think Heinola would make a lot of sense? What do you think about some of the vibe stuff? Are you happy with the state of the team? Do you feel like there's room for improvement? I'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. We might talk about some of that this week, maybe go back through some of the comment sections from the last few games. I know a lot of you have left plenty of feedback over the last couple of weeks, so I might take some time to talk about it since there's not a lot of Jets action this week. And of course, we've done a lot of trade deadline coverage. So now it's time to just sort of talk about fan feedback. And I think that might be this week's subject for discussion. So again, drop your recent thoughts in the comments below or at my social medias on Twitter. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow for even more Winnipeg Jets coverage, so don't go anywhere. And as always, thanks for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.